smart about early literacy instruction. This little webinar was designed for individuals who were unable to attend the in-person or the Zoom version of our speech-to-print book studies, and it is also designed for any individual who would like to just go through the content again and have it as a review. We are going to be looking at Chapter 8 and Chapter 1 in Louisa Moats' Speech to Print. We're going to do half of those chapters combined in this session and half in the second session. There will be some goals that we will not cover from Chapter 8 because we will wait until the end of all the chapters before we kind of put them all together in one big whole and we come back to review this a little bit. So Chapter 8's goal is going to be revisiting tenets of explicit literacy instruction and how that is different from traditional teaching or what we've seen as business as usual. We're also going to look at some outlined steps for a structured literacy plan and what kind of key components need to be included within that plan so that you can cover that nice natural progression from speech to print. We're also going to identify some priorities for students in different phases of reading and spelling development that will have to hit key points in that they can develop those key points and that will improve their ability to increase in each of those phases. Two that we're not going to worry about in this particular session is understanding the writing samples and summarizing those big ideas. We will get to looking at writing samples and gleaning from them their students' instructional needs, but we need to wait until after Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 in order to understand those a little better. So, we can only teach well what we ourselves understand. So as we learn more and we understand more of how early literacy is developed and what the research is telling us, we will be able to adapt our practices and improve our teaching to be able to do those things well. So when we know better, we do better. All right, so structured literacy. How is that different from traditional literacy instruction? What makes this science of reading movement shift gears from what we've been doing for years? And that's what we're going to focus on right now. Some of the big components that we will notice as a shift is that we want to be explicit, which means that we are going to tell them straight up what the information is. We're not going to leave to chance or misunderstanding. Let's just choose a better word. Leave it up to misconceptions about what the concepts are, what the sounds are, what the connections are. We're going to explicitly teach them and model that. It's going to be direct instruction, but direct instruction with a deeper purpose and a little bit more attention on some corrective feedback and some guidance. Lessons be systematic. Systematic means that we will have instructional routines that maximize our time on task and engages students fully in responding and learning and connecting the pieces together. We're going to make sure that they are purposeful and they also allow us room for some corrective feedback when we hear errors coming up or being detected. The pacing will be appropriate for the age level as well as the responses of the students. Another part of structured literacy is that it will be sequential, which means that we will be teaching foundational skills first, and then those will be building upon higher level skills. Precursor skills or prerequisite skills will be developed to mastery before we go to the next phases. And this will be across the lesson and across the grade level. Now, let's take explicit instruction a little bit deeper. If you would like to reference this in the speech to print book, then take a look at page 254 and 255, where Louisa talks a little bit more about explicit instruction. But you can also take a look at Anita Archer's book called Explicit Instruction, where she goes into a lot more detail of what this could look like. So first off, ask yourself, what do you think an explicit lesson looks like? What would an explicit lesson teaching the phonics pattern CK look like? What things might you see that would be different than, per se, a Socratic lesson or even a direct instruction lesson? Things that you need to be aware of is that an explicit instruction lesson will have new skills directly modeled. You will have students guided to the correct response, and you'll have high student engagement as they are responding. You'll use corrective feedback to immediately correct or redirect some of the responses students make, and that the skills will be practiced to mastery, producing the automaticity that we need so that this becomes part of their students' knowledge base or connecting part of that neurological pathway. The pace is going to be brisk, and there are going to be many opportunities for students to interact with the content and with the teacher. So here is an example of an explicit lesson in action. We will only watch a portion of this.
All right, boys and girls, today we're going to learn a new sound spelling on our sound spelling card. Are you ready?
Yeah.
The card that we're going to learn today is the camera card. What card is this? The camera card. The sound of the camera is k. What's the sound? Yes, k. Listen to this story because it's going to help us remember the sound of k. Here we go. Carlos has a new camera. When he takes pictures, his camera makes a clicking sound like this. K, 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 k. In the garden, Carlos takes pictures of caterpillars crawling on cabbage. Are you ready to take some pictures? K, 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 k. Nice job. At the zoo, Carlos takes pictures of a camel, a duck, and a kangaroo. Ready? K, k. Super. Can you help Carlos take pictures with his camera? Are you ready? Show me. Nice job. So when you see that camera, you know the sound is going to be? Yes. Very, very good. Excellent job. Today we're learning a new spelling. You'd already learned that the sound k can be spelled with a C. Today we're going to learn that the sound k can be spelled with a green box CK. Can you all say that with me? Green box CK.
Okay, so let's talk about systematic routines. When we're looking at systematic routines, we're asking ourselves how they can help the students learn a new concept. The idea and philosophy behind systematic routines is that the students will understand the task in which you want them to be able to complete, and they can spend most of their attention and their cognitive load focused on the new idea or the new skill. So if you take a look at the encoding routine on the left, you can see that a systematic routine is a dialogue between student and teacher, where the teacher is going to signal and prompt the student through the task in order for them to practice and master the concept. The one that you see as the example is an encoding routine to help them spell using a pattern that you just taught. That in the explicit part of the lesson, you taught them how to recognize the sound and how to articulate the sound, and attached it to a spelling pattern and the rules in which the pattern will be used. That's all part of your explicit lesson. Now you're going to practice using that pattern in a routine that helps them to focus on when that pattern occurs and not the fact that they're trying to spell a word. I know that sounds kind of strange, but you'd be surprised on how easy it is for a student to learn this routine and then really apply and use it when they're trying to spell the word on their own. We're going to see an example in just a few minutes of a gentleman trying to establish a routine with his students. Please note that he is only starting a systematic routine. He is not a very good example of embedding explicit instruction within this routine. Now, the routine we tend to talk about a lot is a spelling routine or an encoding routine. There are lots of different routines that will help to solidify some of these concepts that interweave with explicit and corrective feedback. Such things as phonological awareness with Haggerty. Haggerty has a lot of routines that help the kids to practice those skills in a very time-efficient way. There are decoding routines. There are fluency routines. There are even writing routines that can help the student to be able to build a sentence, build a paragraph, and continue to increase those skills by practicing those tasks and practicing that skill to mastery. So please keep in mind that in order for a skill or a lesson to be systematic, We want those routines to guide students to correct responses. Use a signal to show them when they need to respond. Don't rely on individual turns. There is a way to masterfully do that in a systematic routine, but you have to be very purposeful, and you have to make sure that it's not in isolation to where one student's answering, the rest of them have checked out. So there's a way to guide everyone responding, and then one person might be answering and one person vocalizes the response. You're not going to ask them questions to leave it open-ended. You already know what the answer you're listening for, and the kids will know too. It's going to maximize your instructional time, so that way you can keep things fast-paced. Students have a chance to practice and move on to the next one. So you have high student engagement, and your higher kids tend not to be lost and distracted. Your low kids are scaffolded enough that they are able to keep up. And there are ways to adjust the routine to differentiate amongst high achievers and struggling readers, to where you add scaffolding for the lower ones, but you let the higher ones move forward. And we can talk about that on an individual basis to your class, because a lot of those differentiations can be universal, but a lot of them will be based on your individual personalities and individual dynamic of your class. You're going to have a cumulative review as part of your routines. You have things like the auditory drill, the visual drill, the blending drill, which all will be on review skills. Students are all going to be full participants. If you notice that you are more teacher talk, then you do not have a routine established. So let's take a look at a systematic routine in action. Please remember, this is the example I was talking about that does not have an explicit component in it. He misses a couple of opportunities to be explicit and give corrective feedback. We'll watch a little portion of it, and then we'll talk about how maybe this routine could be improved a little bit. So let's take a look.
Ready?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to work on our sounds and our words. All right.
When they are flying, they look like real.
All right.
Like they are going.
All right. Here we go. All right. Hands on the table, please. Say shop.
Shop.
We're going to say the sounds in shop. And when we say the sounds in shop, we're going to move our coins. All right, you ready? So do it with me. Ready? Here we go. Ah. Okay, now we're going to write our sounds. So what was the first sound? How do we spell sh? No, how do we spell S? How do we spell sh?
S-C. H-S.
So if you notice, he missed a prime opportunity to give some explicit corrective feedback by going back and talking about the way the sound feels, shh, and how that is now connected to our SH pattern. Then he can go back and ask him again. Our first sound was shh. How are we going to spell shh? And they hopefully then would say SH. Something else that I noticed this time watching him establish this routine is it would have been a little better for him to have them repeat the word before they broke it up into sounds again, or after they broke up into sounds. And the first time he had them say the word shop, he didn't give any kind of corrected feedback for some of their mispronunciation. They weren't really saying shh, they were saying sop. And he missed that opportunity to go back and refocus on that sound there. So that's kind of the first indication that they were going to get the wrong spelling, is they did not have the correct articulation. So if I were going to adjust this routine, he has it set up really well, hands on table, and he says we're going to do the word shop. What was the word? Shop. Let's say the sounds in shop and move our tiles up. Sh, op. What was the word? Shop. Our first sound was sh. And then they could do what shall we use to spell that sh? And of course, putting in corrective feedback he needs in there. So he was establishing a routine that, had he put the corrective feedback in there, they would have been able to come on task. Sadly, if you watch the video a little further, he goes for several minutes of just asking, what do we use? What do we use? And the girls continually give him the wrong answer, which is just making a higher frustration level for those girls, and they are not practicing correctly the pattern. He needs to go back and reteach that.
Ready?
Okay, so let's take a look at now sequential progression. This is referenced on 255 and 256. So thinking about sequence, where do you find guidelines for which skills should be taught first? Now, teachers are pros at this. They have lots of resources such as the pacing guide, the scope and sequence of the curriculum, but I'm going to ask you to go a little bit deeper. When you're looking for what should come first, S or T or L or Q, if you're in kindergarten, or if you're asking, well, if I taught S, H, and CH, well, should I teach WH first? Or when do I bring in CK? Is that a digraph blend that needs to come in, or is it a silent letter combination? There are researched guidelines that sometimes the curriculums will follow. Sometimes they do not, and I'm not exactly sure what their justification is, but you see it the worst in the older grades, when you might have third graders spend an entire week on short vowels, or you might have first graders that have to go back and spend the first half of the year on letter identification and letter sounds, individual letter sounds, as opposed to what they should be working on. So how do you know when to move on? Well, if the students are showing mastery, then you know that you can move on as a whole group. But if you have individuals that are not showing mastery, then is your prime time to bring in intervention, activities and practices and instruction that help fill in some of those potholes. So yes, we do have a grain of salt where we move on because our pacing guide dictated by the district says that we must cover all of these chapters and all of these sections. But if we are progressing through the week, think about the sequence through the week to when your students are ready to move to the next deeper level of the skill. So this is when we start thinking about skills taught in order from easiest to harder. This isn't just, oh, I'm going to teach M before I teach long AI. No, this is within your week as well of, all right, I've shown this part of the lesson, we've done the introduction. What's my progression? What's harder as I move through the week so the students become more independent? Think about the prerequisites. If I want them to decode or if I want them to read sentences, what has to be done first? Is it truly decoding right off the box? Or should we do some encoding? Should we do some focus on where the sound is located? So sequential progression is not just, oh, I'm going to teach closed syllable before I teach open syllable. It's actually within your lesson as well. Foundational skills are going to precede those higher order skills. The foundations of phonological awareness is going to have to precede decoding. There's going to be intentional sequencing within your lesson and across your grade levels. So what does that look like? Should we be doing short vowels in 5th grade? No, you should not be. If the sequence and the explicitness and the systematic routines are within your lesson and you're teaching those to mastery, there is no reason why you should be doing an explicit lesson on short vowels in 5th grade. It should be review if needed, and really short vowels should be reviewed for only of those students who still don't show mastery, and intervention, not as a whole class. There are other things you need to be moving on to. So let's take a look at what the researchers say is that developmental sequence. This is referenced from 286 and 287 in speech print in the appendix. It is also connected with other researchers because there is a little bit of debate for some of these breaking points. Something to make sure you're aware of is that every grade level should have mastered the previous grade level's content. So if I've been kindergarten, these concepts are being taught for the first time. When I move on to 1st grade, It is expected that all of our kindergarten skills are mastered, and if there are any skills that are not, then those are covered in intervention. And they're going to be reviewed a little bit. So you get introduced to these concepts, you get them mastered, you solidify that mastery in the next grade, and then you solidify in the next grade the previous grade. So second graders should have mastered kindergarten and pre-K. They should be solidifying and finalizing their mastery of first grade concepts. They should not be learning those for the first time. So if you're going to have review, it's going to be first grade things, but you should not be spending the bulk of your time on those first grade concepts. You should be spending the bulk of your time on the new concepts you find in second grade. This will make a little more sense when we actually look at what is in each grade level. So pre-K is going to be letter names, capitals and lowercase. If you show a lowercase a, the kindergartner should say that's an A, or that's a capital M. As we know, not all kids get to work with the alphabet with their parents or with pre-K, so a lot of kindergartners come into school without any exposure to letter names and sounds. So with pre-K just doing letter names and letter identification, we know we have to embed and work that into kindergarten just because of the huge discrepancy of students not getting exposure to any kind of letters. So in kindergarten, if we're going to start with our letter to sound connections, we start with M-S-T-L-A. They can vary in order. You can have M-A-T-L-S. You could have M-T-A-S-L. It's not too critical that that row stay in the order of M-S-T-L-A, but you wouldn't want that to be switched with maybe row 4 or row 5. So as we look down, we see our one-to-one correspondences continuing on until you hit row 6. Now, 1 through 5, you can have a little variation within that, but they do progress from our most understood sounds, the sounds the kids can make first and the easiest for them to do, to some of the more harder ones, the ones that are a little bit more tricky to identify and to produce. So when we get to row 6, this is when things start to take a deviation from the one-to-one correspondence. Because in row 6, you have Q, U, X, and the first rules of closed syllable, open syllable, and other things such as certain sounds cannot follow other sounds. For example, QU is a consonant blend represented by 2 letters, and one of those letters is typically a vowel. So I often like to joke with teachers and students that, E likes to do a lot of jobs and Y likes to do several jobs. Well, U didn't want to feel left out, and so he wanted to take on another job, and he wanted to be like Y, and sometimes he wants to be a consonant. And so in QU, he gets to take on the W sound. X is unique because what we have with X is a single grapheme or letter that's going to represent 2 phonemes, 2 sounds. He is the only letter in our language that is going to do that. Everybody else either needs their own partner to make 2 sounds, or they will have 2 letters to make 1 sound. X is the only letter that is going to be 1 letter to represent 2 sounds. So he's a bit of an odd duck. Then, of course, we have our single letter long vowels, which is things like no, go, he, she, those open syllables, single, simple, short words. It's not the same as words like coat. These are single letters, or even words like bee, B-E-E. Number 8 is when we start diving into some digraphs where we're going to have 2 letters representing 1 sound. We already introduced them to the weird idea of X, so they're going to get used to this idea that, oh, some strange things are happening. We do the floss pattern, voiced S and TH, and we end the year with consonant blends, consonant blends, consonant blends. Spending a lot of time with this concept of these are 2 sounds that we blend together super quick so it feels like 1 sound, but they each hold their own identity. Now, if you notice, there is a certain pattern not in this box that we often see in kindergarten toward the end of the year. Any guesses? You probably already pegged it. Vowel consonant E is not on the kinder list. It is not, according to some researchers, age appropriate for kindergarten. Kindergarten need to solidify a one-to-one correspondence. And even though CH, TH, and SH don't feel like a one-to-one correspondence, they really are. You will not have other ways to spell TH and SH. It's one sound with this group. So you think of them as a group. Now, CH, will become a little bit trickier later on, but they will focus on that one-to-one correspondence. CH usually is most often spelled as CH for ch. Now, solidifying those should happen as they go, but they don't have to completely master it until they reach first grade. And first grade now says, okay, we're going to use all of that to review. Should be very fast to review all those. And this is where we spend the most of our time because these are new concepts. And if you notice right out of the gate, vowel consonant E. First grade is going to be all the new variations with the slight rules that change the spelling away from what they were taught in kindergarten. So if you have the letter A and you learned in kindergarten that it was a short vowel and it says ah, well, first grade is the realm in which you now get to discover that adding on a silent E will change the sound. The sound is now allowed to say A. You also have things like diphthongs and vowel teams. They are ready to start this idea that our letter combinations can create different things to our sounds. Our sounds will require different combinations for different places that they might occur. Now, these are complicated and these get kind of crazy. So most of first grade should be focused in on these new patterns. Because first grade curriculums often make the teachers go back and redo all of kindergarten, the first grade concepts are not taught well and the students don't get the adequate time and practice. So therefore, they're just rolled over into second grade. And this is when I look at curriculums, I said, if you do your job right the first time, you will not have to make second and third grade repeat the lessons that you should have taught correctly in the previous grades. So that's a discussion to have amongst people and powers that be of, okay, kinder, we need to require kindergarten because there's a lot of concepts and there's a lot of complicated things in first grade that we need to spend time on, and we can't go back and teach what should have been taught a whole year before. Now, let's move on to second grade. Second grade is a little bit less forgiving, or a little bit more forgiving, I guess, but how you say it, because they should not be spending any time in kindergarten. If you have holes in kindergarten, you need to take care of that in intervention. You might briefly use them as an introduction to reviewing the first grade concepts. You are more than welcome to review first grade concepts before you start your new ideas. Now, these can be in big groups. For example, if you're reviewing vowel teams for long O, yes, you will be reviewing all of the long O patterns unless they are part of these new concepts. Those will be independently. So as you look through your curriculum, you will see diphthongs all together in a lesson, or you'll see final blends and soft G and soft C. That's okay, because at that point it should be review. You shouldn't have to spend so much time teaching that the first time, but then just solidifying it. The ones that should be by themselves are each of these. You need to spend time really teaching those and really being explicit, because that's brand new for second grade. So let's go on to third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. What key skills do you think are going to be covered in these upper grades? Well, if we take the principle from the previous page that grade 3 needs to review the previous grade as quick review, because that's solidifying those new concepts from the year before, they should not be spending their time in the whole core class
teaching the first grade and the kindergarten things. They should be focused on solidifying all those correspondences between letter and sound. They should be connecting those patterns and conventions to their syntax, their semantics, their vocabulary. They should be analyzing through morphology. They should be connecting to comprehension with word choice and how that changes the overall meaning. They should be looking at how homophones and homonyms will alter the meaning, how punctuation can save the day or you can eat grandma. There's a lot of ways that certain word choices and literacy devices will alter the meaning of the word, and how one letter or one morpheme can change the whole identity of that sentence. That's where the fun really begins with being word nerds. Those things happen in older grades. Now we're going to put a pause on chapter 8 right there, because we will cover the rest in the second half, and we will stop for just a minute and pick up again with the beginning of chapter 1. Take a look at chapter 1, the reading brain. So why in the world do we want to start with learning a language in order to learn to read? Why do we start with speech? Well, in this chapter, we're going to take a look at that. We're going to look at what is the relationship between language and literacy. What are the systems that make up our language, and why is reading so hard to learn for some people? We're going to look at the research, we're going to look at some phases, and we're going to talk about some of those basic principles that we took from structured literacy in chapter 8 and what that means for our focus, what we focus on with our lessons being explicit, systematic, and sequential. So let's tap back into the brain. We know on the left side of our brain, this is our language center. We are born with the ability to learn a language, to learn to speak. And so as an educator, we are tapping into those neurological pathways established at birth to learn language. And we are going to create new gray matter and new pathways connecting these different parts of the brain in order to read our language. So the key components of the brain that we're going to be rewiring and readjusting are the angular gyrus. Now, the angular gyrus is very closely related to the frontal lobe and the Broca's area. Now, this is where a bulk of our decodability is going to occur in connection to the occipital lobe, where we see the letters and representations. But we don't want to leave the Wernicke area out, because this is our comprehension center. So let's take a look at each piece and we'll talk about how they interweave together instantaneously to learn to read by sight. So, frontal lobe, this is responsible for articulation, for phonemic awareness, to build and manipulate those phonemes. You're going to build your words up here in the frontal lobe. In the Broca's area, we're going to be communicating with the muscles in our mouth and our voice box, and we're going to be able to command them to produce these sounds, to discriminate those sounds in speech. You're going to have them come in and out here. So think of word creation in both of these areas. But we also have the angular gyrus, which is going to be responsible for taking those sounds that you just broke up and you're playing around with and manipulating in the frontal lobe and the Broca's area, and we're going to be connecting all of that to the phonetical structure and organizing those into symbols, which means we better be talking with the occipital lobe that is bringing in the visual input sensitive to the letter patterns and the features of individual letters into the angular gyrus, which is pulling information from the frontal lobe and passing it back and forth. Now, all of this, of course, has to be connected to meaning, because we have a morphophonemic language, which means our language is going to change meaning if one sound changes. Perfect example is cat versus cot. The only thing that changed in that word was the center sound. Cat is something vastly different than cot. If I tried to take a nap on a cat, I would have a vastly different experience than taking a nap on a cot. All of that distinction is going to happen through the Wernicke area, where you're going to be attaching meaning and prior knowledge and distinguishing context. Your lexicon is going to be housed there. Now, if I want to be a successful reader and be able to use this information for comprehension, I'm going to have very fast movement, instantaneous, and at the same time between all of these areas. Dyslexia occurs when there is inefficient movement in specific areas of the brain. So let's take a quick look at this video and find out a little bit more detail about what exactly dyslexia is. Or not. I thought it was going to play. So I guess I will back up and I will show you. Going to occur because you have inefficient movement in some key areas of the brain. We've been able to do some MRI scans of people who are non-dyslexic and those who have dyslexia, and they're asked the same tasks. A lot of these tasks involve different aspects of reading or elements that we know develop reading. And if we look at, say, this brain right here in the middle, you can see at one point they have the angular gyrus and part of the visual lobe activating, and you can start to see the beginnings of the frontal lobe starting to activate. Now, please remember that an MRI is a movie. It is showing constant movement, and all these are just one snapshot. So you don't get to see every part of the brain that's active when it should be active because it is instantaneous. So in this one snapshot, you can see that you've got a lot of good activity going on in the places that are supposed to be going on, and you see the beginnings of activity up here in the frontal lobe. Now, on a dyslexic reader, you do not have that same activity at the same moment. There is nothing starting up in the frontal lobe, and there is nothing going on with the angular gyrus. That is because dyslexia lives in a phonological inefficient movement. So you won't see a lot of activity in the frontal lobe where the phonological awareness center is at, or even in the angular gyrus, which is the first thing it connects to, and be able to manipulate those phonemes and be able to connect those to situations and things. Again, you start to see the beginnings in a non-dyslexic brain. Nothing. Very inefficient. You'll notice that there's some heightened activity on the opposite side because the brain is trying to compensate for what should be happening here. Someone might ask, well, what about all of this information on here? Well, again, you've got activation around the ears for the sounds coming in. The angular gyrus does that. And maybe this particular student has a little bit of compensation trying to go on, or there might be some other things affecting this reader, such as the hippocampus is slightly heightened. This guy was a little bit nervous. Another way you can see is a typical reader where you might have the angular gyrus connecting to the Wernicke area with the visual cortex. Their broca areas activate as well. You won't have all of those. You'll be missing some pieces. So again, it's that inefficient movement, the inefficient activation of certain parts of the brain. So they're not creating the pathways. They're not getting from the instantaneous movement that they need. So what does that mean? Well, that means as an educator, we need to build those pathways. We have to be very explicit and systematic and sequential and very purposeful in our activities and the repetition of those activities so that we build that gray matter and that becomes more efficient. So we know that through looking at the brain scans and looking at the brain as a whole, that language and literacy is not primarily a visual skill. As years and years and years thought that you could see it and you just see it and you know it. Nope, there's a lot more involved than just looking at letters and looking at words. You have to use your auditory, visual, and kinesthetic processes. We are all multimodality learners. We all are auditory, visual, and kinesthetic learners. So we're going to use all of them in multiple modes to help get those pathways created. We're going to use word recognition and language comprehension in order to reach reading comprehension. It's a multiplication sentence on purpose. If you have a 0 on one side, you're going to end up with 0 comprehension. So kindergartners, yes, you need language comprehension as at the same time as when you're doing your word recognition. And 4th, 5th graders, you need to have word recognition at the same time you're developing your language comprehension, because you're not quite done yet. So many struggling students need explicit systematic instruction before they habitually notice details of both speech and print. So let's take that simple view of reading and let's go more in depth. Let's take the word recognition side and break it down. Let's take the language comprehension side and let's break it down. Older grades, you'll notice that your part of the rope is well intertwining and well more connected than some of these more in isolation. Now, something to note about the word recognition, this one is easy to diagnose and easy to track because word recognition is a finite skill. Eventually, you will be able to read. You will be able to decode. Language comprehension is not a finite skill. It doesn't really have an ending point because you will be learning and understanding things at different levels until the day you die. So it is a little harder to diagnose that or to give a standardized test on that. There are ways to do it, but it's usually more intensive than computerized testing wants to do. Let's take a look at those. So background knowledge and language comprehension is going to be everything the kid brings to the table. Facts, concepts, understanding that they already know about a certain topic. Vocabulary is going to be exactly what it says. The breadth, the precision, the word choice, the meanings, how they link together. Language structure is going to be your syntax, your word structure, your nuances when you put paragraphs together, and what the punctuation does. Verbal reasoning is kind of where we consider our comprehension house. This is where we're going to inference, we're going to use metaphors, we're going to use literary devices, we're going to compare and contrast. We're going to be able to use the reasoning that helps us to explain we know what's going on. The literacy knowledge is concepts of print, genres, text organization. If we understand how these passages, how a narrative is put together, we're going to be able to explain why things happen. We're going to be able to predict and infer better. Now, if we tap over to the word recognition side, of course, phonologic awareness is kind of self-explanatory. It's the basis of playing around and manipulating sounds and words. Decoding and sight word recognition is not the same as what we have traditionally put together. Decoding is the alphabetic principle, the sound spelling correspondences. Decoding is encoding. It is spelling. That's where the phonics hits the fan, is in spelling and connecting those letter patterns to the sound. It's not decoding as we might think of it as in blending and fluency. That's sight word recognition. That's learning the patterns and how the code fits together so well that you can see it and know it by sight. That's what we typically call decoding. And sight recognition is not high frequency words. It is not sight word drill practice. All right, so the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. So what needs to be our focus of instruction if we know those are all part of the rope? That's one of the reasons why I created this infograph. It's that you can see the flow of the lesson that is going to gradually increase focus in the bottom areas as the week goes by. Now, if we look at Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and a 4-day week, every day should have a 3-part drill of the skills that were previously taught. So they need to practice things to mastery. So you need to have a visual drill, an auditory drill, and a blending drill that does not contain your new concept until you have finished through the entire flow. Then you add it in, because you're going to be having some of that review throughout these other elements that you're going to be more explicit and purposeful about. This is just review, and it should be pretty fast every day. Now, after the 3-part drill, you start our word recognition flow. You start with the whole class doing some phonological awareness work. Now, depending on your grade level, this could be the robust practice that practices and tackles all skills. You might have to go and specifically teach one skill depending on the needs of your students or their age level. Once we've gotten that robust practice in and we're ready to move on, we've activated the engine and our brain, our language part of our brain is ready to go. Then we're going to start on day 1 introducing our new concept, our new sound. And we are starting with the sound. We are not starting with a letter base. We're going to focus on the articulation for that sound, where that sound is located, any co-articulation rules that might occur with that sound, any phonotactic rules. And we'll talk a little bit more about phonotactic rules in chapter 3. But basically, those are rules that say certain sounds in English cannot precede or follow other sounds. Now, if we've established this sound and we're like, we can recognize it, we can identify where it is, we can feel it, we can hear it, then we are ready to attach a letter group or a letter to it, a representation. So this is orthographic mapping. That's making the sound letter connection. Here's where you're inputting the code. This is the sound. Here is the code. We're going to represent it. Now, you can orthographically map in several ways. I personally love starting the week off with encoding and using sound spelling boxes because it gives the students a chance to take that work with listening to the sounds that you just did and continually putting the same pattern that you're teaching them to it. Now, you can also do sorting, word sorts. You can do orthographic mapping with word chaining. You can do a lot with embedding into sentences sometimes with this. So there's a lot of different ways, graph tapping, things like that you can do with orthographic mapping. It's basically establishing the sound to the letter code that it represents. Now, at this time, you'll need to make sure that you talk about any graphotactic rules, which we'll talk more about in chapter 4. And graphotactic rules are those that say when the sound occurs here, this is the pattern we use and why. So those ones are very important when you're establishing that connection to make sure they understand. And then you also have discussions for those opportunities in English when they don't follow the typical pattern, but they might have a helpful hint to tell them why it's going to be something different. Now, once you've established that code and has some of the routines have some embedded blending in there, you are ready to tackle that code in written words where they don't actually have to connect it. They're actually going to have that unified and decodability ready to go. Continuous blending, fluency, word families. This is when you have your blending boards and you're going to have your handwriting. You're going to have them write the pattern out if they're younger grades. Now, this is one that I say on Monday you can back off the blending board a little bit because you can do a routine that has embedded blending and decoding in it to save yourself some time. Tuesday, excuse me, do a phoneme review if you need it. Spend the bulk of your time after your warm-up and your review to strengthening and solidifying that code you established the day before. Do a lot more encoding, a lot more pattern sorting, anything to give them further exposure of creating with that code. Then you can spend some more time in blending and decoding that. Over onto Wednesday, same thing. Only as needed. I would probably not do an articulation review on this day. And then Thursday, do a quick review because you can do an encoding review and assessment and then spend a lot of time applying it, responding to text and decodable readers. So, creating the flow. Now, I know that a lot of people are asking, what about language comprehension? We're going to talk more about that come year 2. So I'm going to briefly pop over that one. And this is going to conclude the first half of chapter 8 and chapter 1. So to be continued in the next section, we're going to go through and look at specifics to our structured literacy. Like, where do we find these pieces? How do we use what our curriculum has, and what do we need that our curriculum doesn't? We're also going to take a little deeper look at each one of these sections in conjunction with chapter 8. Like, what does our curriculum have? What would the routines look like for these sections? All right, you can also have access to the Google Drive where you'll find a lot of this information, a lot of tools to help you out. And if you are watching this webinar as a makeup or because you missed the last one, I would like you to go through and look for these components in your current curriculum before you start the next section. Mark the items with a sticky note and label them which part of structural literacy you feel that it belongs to. Do you think that it's a phonological awareness activity? Do you think it's focusing on just the sound and the articulation of the sound? Do you think that it's the breaking the code? Is it attaching the sound to the coded letter group? Or is it decoding and blending? Take a really critical look at that and be ready to connect that to what we're going to be doing in the next section. Okay? So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.